Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Emmanuel Center. It does feel a little weird that we're in a church when we're going to hell. I'm delighted to be in conversation with my wonderful friend, Rebecca Kuang. She is the award-winning #1 New York Times, #1 Sunday Times bestselling author of the Poppy War trilogy, Babel and Yellowface. She has an MPhil in Chinese Studies from Cambridge and an MSc in Contemporary Chinese Studies from Oxford. She's now pursuing a PhD in East Asian Languages and Literature at Yale. We're here to celebrate her brand new fantasy, Katabasis. So, are we ready to go to hell? Let's go. Okay, let's start with the title. First of all, is it pronounced Katabasis? Because you've now written 2 novels where we have a suspect pronunciation, where we've had to have a debate over it. So what is a Katabasis, and am I saying it right?
Okay, first of all, good evening, London. This is my first book event for this book, and it's always really special to be able to do it here, the second best city in the world. So thank you very, very much for coming out to join us. Also, look at this box. I will try very hard not to play with it while I'm talking. Okay, I don't know what it is about my book titles and debates over their pronunciation. I think it's because academics have this reputation for being pedantic and scolding people for saying things wrong, but I have never cared how people say Babel, Babel. I pronounce it differently, I think, depending on where I am. In the UK, Babel seems more popular, so I say it that way here. Katabasis, I have received conflicting advice from classicists who are supposed to know what they're talking about. And I used to say Katabasis. I think that was intuitive, but then I watched this video where it said in this very artificial sounding voice, Katabasis. And that's actually how we say it at home. Bennett always pronounces it Katabasis, which is hard to do in casual conversation. But honestly, my long ramble about this is I hate it when people make fun of people for pronouncing things wrong. I learned English mostly visually. I learned it when I was a bit older as a child, so most of my words I was learning through reading for the first time because nobody was pronouncing them around me, and I still mispronounce a lot of things, so don't be an asshole when you think somebody's wrong.
I agree.
But Katabasis is the Greek word for the hero's descent to the underworld, and it can literally mean the underworld, and I took it literally. My characters do, in fact, go to hell, but it can also metaphorically refer to a story structure in which a character reaches the lowest of their lows. They've lost everything. They are struggling to find a reason to move forward, to keep living. They're disgusted with themselves. They feel like, they've just reached rock bottom. So metaphorically, the Katabasis story structure also applies to narratives about suicide, about depression. There are Katabasis narratives about the Holocaust, about addiction. And I was very interested also in this metaphorical, psychological journey. When you've reached a point in your life where you feel like it's no longer worth living, where you don't want to see tomorrow, what would it take to climb out of that? What reason would you have to discover for yourself? And I like to think I gave my characters a reason.
Yeah. All right, so can you give us a brief overview of what this novel is about before we jump into it? I know it's the worst question ever.
It's why you shouldn't do a PhD. So Katabasis is about 2 PhD students studying analytic magic, and my husband does analytic philosophy, although they don't really like that term because it makes them seem fusty, but they are. But here, philosophy is cool because it does magic. So this is a book for his field, what Babel was for my field, translation and linguistics. Anyways, Peter and Alice are going to hell to rescue the soul of their advisor, Professor Jacob Grimes, who has died tragically in a freak magic accident, which was probably Alice's fault. And they need him to come back to life to write them recommendation letters so that they can get jobs as tenure-track professors in analytic magic in the very tough job market. I wrote this book before our current leader was elected and before we understood what kind of attacks were coming for American higher education. And I'm now on the job market, so it's hitting very close to home.
Yeah, for sure. What was the origin of this story? Like, when in your academic journey did you decide that this was the moment for this novel?
Pretty early.
Yeah.
Well, so the Academy is a really ridiculous place in a lot of ways, and I have been in it for most of my life, so I think a lot about its problems and how to satirize them and critique them. And naturally, I do this because if you love something, then you want it to be better, and you want to theorize about the best possible version of it, which requires a kind of unflinching analysis of all the corrupt things about it. So that's where Babel came from. So I had been thinking about the flip side to Babel, which was this big structural, socio-historical critique of the university as an institution which, the modern university is an institution which rose out of these regimes of slavery and colonialism and imperialism. But I also wanted to tunnel in to look at the psychological effects of the really weird way our academies are structured, where your entire future kind of hinges on if your advisor likes you. I mean, this is a breeding ground for really narcissistic, egotistic personalities. It's also kind of a devastating place if you buy into the cult of the genius, particularly the male genius, or the idea that teachers can do whatever they like to their students who trust them. So I had this fun little satire where two students went to hell to rescue their advisor, who they don't even like all that much. But then as I kept writing, I realized that, well, why hell exactly? And what deeper themes are trying to emerge from me. And the backstory to all this is the first semester of my PhD program really sucked. My now husband, my then boyfriend, Bennett, and I, we started our PhDs at the same time, and we were just really excited. COVID seemed to finally be over. We were back on campus. We both received these really generous funding packages on these gorgeous campuses, and we were just excited to go to class and have all these ideas and share them. And then he got really, really sick, and we've talked a lot about what that was like. So suddenly I was driving from class for hours to where he was and crying all the time and sitting in the hospital and just being really terrified at the fact that he was losing so much weight, and for a long time we didn't know what was wrong with him. So yeah, without delving too much into all of that, I realized that this book was also a way for me to explore the depression and mental illness and the chronic illness that we were dealing with at the time. And we've come out the other side of it, and maybe Alice and Peter will too, or maybe they won't.
I really appreciated, as someone who has multiple invisible conditions, just how much space you gave to it in this book, and I think you did it so wonderfully, and the fact that you were drawing from personal experience really shines through. You've studied at Oxford, Georgetown, and Cambridge. Why did you go for Cambridge as the hell novel? Obviously, you've been... I love this as an Oxonian. Obviously, you completely obliterated Oxford in Babel. But for me, I was almost thinking Yale was the more naturally hellish one, because it has all the tombs and the secret societies and stuff. Why did you go for Cambridge for the setting for this?
Well, Leigh Bardugo did Yale already, and it just seemed redundant. I have a couple of answers. The easy one is I just felt like it was Cambridge's turn, because Oxford has this outsized space in, I think, the dark academia imaginary and in fantasy literature. You did Oxford, Philip Pullman did Oxford, J.R.R. Tolkien did Oxford, which is the Shire, but it's Oxford. And Cambridge seemed so underrepresented. But I really loved my time at Cambridge. I had a pretty terrible time at Oxford for all sorts of reasons, but the main one being that was in 2020 and there was a pandemic. But when I was at Cambridge, I really liked my program. I had a good advisor. I was in the boat club, and I was coxing, so all my memories were of early mornings, freezing on the River Cam. The thing about coxing is everybody else gets a good workout, so even when it's very cold, they don't feel cold, but the cox just sits there and says something sometimes and tries not to hit anything. So by the end, they would have to lift me out of the boat because all of my limbs had frozen. But aside from that, it was a really nice time. But Cambridge is not actually hell. You discover within the first few chapters that hell's this nonsense landscape that is reconstituting itself as they progress through the courts. And the reason why it resembles a campus that's very much like Cambridge is because it's closest to the moral universe that they recognize. So that's the first answer. The second has to do with Wittgenstein. I was very interested in the development of British philosophy during and after the war. I was also interested in what happened to British academia during the Thatcher years. This book is set in the 1980s because we're very familiar with what happened to American academia during the Reagan years. And there's a line in the book about how on both sides of the Atlantic, the conservatives were in power, which meant that funding for higher education was drying up. So I was interested in this particular political moment in the UK where the university was no longer this meritocratic, if it ever was, gateway towards a better life, but it was becoming harder and harder to enter academia and stay there. So.
And in that timeline that you've chosen, it was just after, I think, Magdalen College formally accepted women as well? Yeah, so that comes in.
Alice is in Magdalen College, which is a bit anachronistic because she wouldn't actually have been permitted to the year that she started.
Oh, interesting, huh? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about hell. You've clearly thought about the physics of hell and how two people might go about navigating and surviving a literal hellscape. Could you explain some of the ways that you visualized hell looking and behaving? I believe the analogy used in the book is the pizza anus. Or one of them.
So one thing I really like about my magic systems and my magical worlds is I hate it when they're obvious and clearly definable and the answers are easy to reach. I prefer it when the magic is just like any other field of study where there's more disagreement than agreement and our characters are conducting all these inquiries to try to nail down what's going on, but they have competing theories and we never really know what's true or not. Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, I had to learn hyperbolic geometry to write this book. And this is not my intention because I thought I was finished with math in college. But my agent is an English math double major, and her husband is a math professor. So already my topography was a little paradoxical because things would appear really far away, but then end up being very close. Or they were able to see all of hell at once, but it was this chaotic, primordial flux. And when they read this, my agent came and said, oh, well, I think there's a really simple mathematical explanation for your hell. It doesn't follow the rules of Euclidean geometry, which is, even though our world doesn't actually obey the rules of Euclidean geometry, it is the most available and convenient framework for us. But this world follows the rules of hyperbolic geometry, in which the parallel postulate is removed. That's a lot of phrases that you will never have to know for any practical purpose. But I had to study things like the Poincaré disk model and coral, and I think Pringle chips become relevant at some point because they're a good visual representation of how space might curve here. Anyways, so there's that. Hell is wonky and looks like coral / Pringle chips. The other thing is, I didn't want to stick to one mythological representation of hell. I thought that would have been really boring. I actually started with a Chinese Buddhist conception of hell because I liked the rigid bureaucracy and I liked the idea that they really were just these courts of judgment that looked like a medieval Chinese court. But as I kept reading around, I wanted to be more syncretic with my influences and pull in the Greeks, of course, and pull in Indian mythology and just ideas about what hell would look like from all over the world, because I love the idea that everybody is representing the same phenomenon with different metaphors, the same way one might be climbing the same mountain from different sides. So hell is a little bit of everything, and we can delve more into this, but I zoned in on the areas of overlap that I found between cultures, such as the river and the importance of forgetting, but I'm sure you have questions about those too.
Yeah, I was about to ask, like, what are some of the similarities between different schools of belief about the afterlife that you found interesting? Because I love that you combine, like, Lady Meng Po with the River Leith and, like, having her be the one to kind of deliver the Leith water. Like, were there anything when you were doing your research, like, were you just interested in places where perhaps completely separate cultures had come up with similar ideas about the afterlife?
Yeah, okay, we'll just talk about the rivers right now.
Yeah.
So obviously in Greek mythology, there is the river Lethe, which washes away your memory. And I found that in almost every single mythology about the afterlife, there is the concept of a river. It seems to be very important that there's this body of moving water, this scar in the earth that demarcates the bounds between the world of the living and the world of the dead. So it's like, why river, why water, why moving water? This seemed central. And I think it has to do with Heraclitus' theories of flux. And Heraclitus famously has that line about how you can never step in the same river twice. It's a different river by that point. The molecules that make up the water are different. And the book is very interested in theories of change and theories of time. So we explore a lot of that. But I'm also fascinated by the importance of memory, because the river Lethe washes away your memories of a past life so you can be cleansed and reborn and ready to live again. And one interesting question is, if you're a soul that has had all your memories of a past identity washed away, is that not equivalent to death? And if not, then what is immortal and persisting about the soul? So I try to explore that. But I'm also interested in, beyond being essential for reincarnation and rebirth, the role that memory has, or really forgetting has, in getting over trauma and restorative justice. You might think that you would want to remember everything that had ever happened to you, and in fact, that's a fantasy that academics have all the time, to have this photographic memory, to never forget a single detail. But for very spoilery reasons, one character does have this condition where she can't forget things, and I explore why this would be awful. This would make it impossible to move on from previous trauma, because you would be drawn back to the primal scene over and over again, analyzing every single detail until you can sift through what was important. You would lose all sense of personal identity, actually, if you remembered everything. So I forgot the question, but I'm really interested in why forgetting is essential for personal identity.
I will come back to the character who can't forget anything. I was also wondering about, you've talked about your mythological influences. What are some of your literary touchstones for this? It seems very obvious that Dante is one of them, for example. Could you tell us which kind of literary hells you drew from?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. I'm glad we have 3 hours. Well, obviously Dante, and Sam got me a very gorgeous copy of Dante's Inferno for my birthday or a wedding present. As a wedding present, which is going to hell is a weird wedding present to give someone.
It's a love story set in hell, that's on you.
Well, it holds a very prized place in our bookshelf display. But Dante provides a lot of the geographical inspiration, just the idea of this desert landscape, the bleakness, the barrenness. There's also these wonderful descriptions of lust being a storm that's buffeting you around the way that you might be buffeted by your desires. And wrath, rather than being fire, as we might think, wrath being this bog that suffocates you, that you can't breathe from because you're so wrapped up in what you're obsessively wrathful about. So that stuff is great. Thank you, Dante. But another influence that is mentioned over and over again in the text is T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which just on a metatextual level, it was very inspirational to me, because The Wasteland is this modernist detritus of all the epic works that came before. He's not inventing language so much as he taking bits and pieces of stuff he really liked and offering them to you in this like found artwork. And Katabasis does the same, in which it rehearses many, many epic lines about hell and the afterlife, and tries to give a snapshot of how somebody in the 80s might process all of this. The Wasteland is also brilliant just for a few lines. One of them is just a phrase that I got stuck in my head and came back to and over again, withered stumps of time. And again, because I'm interested in time and change and Leibniz's theory that time just is change, I take the idea of withered stumps of time very literally, and we meet those stumps later. There's also a line that goes, I will show you fear in a handful of dust. And that gave me shivers when I read it the first time. So I asked myself what would show my characters fear in a handful of dust. So we've gone through Dante and T.S. Eliot. Okay, just a few more. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, I think that's very self-explanatory. The main character is named for Alice Liddell, and she's curious to a fault. I not only read Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar because, I mean, if you're writing about an ambitious young woman in hell, there's no better voice to learn from than the protagonist of The Bell Jar. But I read a lot of her early diary entries and her correspondence because you find this burning, ambitious mind that just can't get enough of the world, that always wants to know more and read more and be capable of more. And I just love that, like, this desire to eat the world and everything that's in it, which is something that Simone de Beauvoir writes about as well. She's like, the world is like nougat. It's like almond candy. I just want to crunch it. And I took that just unabashed curiosity and intellectual brightness, and I put it in Alice's personality.
Yeah, I love that, and especially the way that you talk about this hunger to learn and how that conflicts with the needs of the body. So I will come back to that because I think that's one of the best things about the book. I loved your vivid depictions of the courts of hell, and I was just wondering which is the one that you would least like to end up in? Because to me, I was very scared of desire, actually.
I was scared of desire, too.
Yeah, whereas I thought pride was quite funny.
I think I would do okay in Pride. I think I would just hang out with G more and smoke cigars with him.
Yeah, and it was a lot of, there was a comment in Pride that lots of creative writing students end up there, and they somehow always end up in groups, which I thought was hilarious. And the comment about the guy who pretended that he taught at Oxford when actually he taught at Oxford Brookes, which is
slander.
There's a lot of that happens.
The line is, oh, I teach in Oxford.
Yeah. So the magic system of the book, let's talk about that a little bit, because it's based on paradoxes and the moment of suspension between belief and disbelief. What drew you to this, and how did you go about learning about paradoxes? I understand you threw a paradox party?
Yeah, I'm so popular at MIT. So I have just enjoyed logic paradoxes for a long time, especially the really classical structure of a paradox, which is just plausible premise, impossible conclusion. And they are just so disorienting because it's like you take 2 steps forward and the ground just bottoms out in front of you. So how could we make a series of choices or have a set of beliefs that leads to something that seems to break the laws of physics? I don't know. And the fun thing about a lot of the classic paradoxes that are taught in philosophy classes is that we still don't have satisfactory answers. I'll give an example, the Sorites problem, the problem of the heap of sand. Suppose that there's a heap of sand on this table, and I'm taking away some sand bit by bit. Plausibly, at some point, it will no longer be a heap. It'll just be like, a few grains of sand. There will still be some sand on the table, but we could not call it a heap. But if I asked you, Sam, at exactly which point does it transform from a heap to not a heap? You probably couldn't tell me, and we could have endless debates about, is this a heap, is this a heap?
Yeah.
And even if I really took my time and removed one grain at once, you still wouldn't be able to say, no, that's not a heap.
Yeah.
So the Sorites problem, one implausible conclusion is that you can keep removing grains of sand and it will be a heap forever. But that's impossible because at some point the sand does run out. So I think that's fun, and that's the heart of the magic system in Katabasis. They inscribe these paradoxes with chalk. And we can talk about why chalk is fun, but basically, I think if you teach with chalk all day, like I do, because they never put me in the rooms with whiteboards, it looks like you just have cocaine all over your clothes at the end of the day. And then there were so many jokes about cocaine that I was like, what if you had magical chalk that you could snort? And that's why it's chalk. So that's how the magic system works. Now, the problem is that I don't study philosophy, and I'm not a logician, so I was only familiar with some very basic paradoxes, like Zeno's paradoxes of motion, and the Sorites problem, and the liar paradox. But fortunately, I am married to a philosopher, and he is colleagues with a lot of logicians. And the thing about philosophers is, if you hand them a glass of wine and say, tell me about your research, they are just so thrilled that somebody's talking to them. So we invited a bunch of people over to our place for a paradox party, and I explained to everybody the basics of the magic system. And we have a whiteboard in the living room because I think all good parties should have a whiteboard, because otherwise how can you explain things to people? And everyone came so well prepared, like there were handouts. And so one by one, I was taught many paradoxes, and then they were fed food that I had prepared. And then those paradoxes became the spells that are in the novel. So shout out to the MIT philosophy department.
Is it nerdy that I really want to go to one of these parties? Like, I would actually love that.
Well, I think a really good way to throw a party is to require everybody to give a presentation, but it can be a presentation on something really stupid. For instance, I once gave a 10-minute PowerPoint presentation on foods that make me side-eye when I hear somebody else order them at a restaurant.
Examples?
And one of my slides said, water with no ice. Do you have weak teeth?
I do sadly have weak teeth. All right, tell us about the function of chalks and pentagrams in your magic system then. Like, what is the power in chalk in this book?
So, something I didn't know about mathematicians and other people in fields where you have to write on blackboards a lot is they're really persnickety about their chalk, and apparently there is this brand of Japanese chalk that writes like really smoothly. It glides on like butter, and I've tried this chalk and it's just like any other chalk. But one character quirk I gave Alice and Peter is that they prefer two different brands of chalk. There's Barkles and there's Stropleys, and they both think that preferring the other brand is evidence of bad character. But then the in-text explanation I give for why only chalk is the material that has this magic charge is because it's made of the ground-up skeletons of sea creatures that have been dead for millions of years, and I call this the living dead energy that's activated by the paradox. And it's true that, and first of all, it makes a lot of sense why there is this giant chalk horse in Uffington. It also lets me play with like the chalk deposits all over England that they have to take field trips to understand where all their chalk is coming from. And there's this wonderful essay from, I believe, the 1800s that's just like this scientific presentation on a single stick of chalk that I like quote word for word in the text because it's by this scientist named Huxley who's just like, chalk is so magical because it comes to us from the bottom of the ocean from these creatures who have been dead for such a long time. And that's just completely non-fictional. He's right, but it just like the silver bars in Babel, like it's this material that already has such an interesting history, so that the push to make it a fantastical, magical material was really easy. And finally, there is a moment where one character, she's told by a ghost, I heard it's more powerful if you snort it. So she does like crumble it up, and it works.
That was a great scene. All right, well, let's talk about one of the differences between Babel and this book, in that you have a female main character. and you're approaching the institution from a specifically female perspective. There's a quote from the book that the academy was sexist was such a boring truism that Alice was no longer disturbed by the fact. She faces unique challenges in academia as a woman, from sexual harassment to inappropriate questions. And one of the scenes I really liked was when she has this conversation with like an older female professor. And it's clear that the feminism is viewed as somewhat embarrassing by the younger women at the university. Because Babel was told from a male perspective, Robin is racially marginalized, but he's not female. I was wondering, what was the difference in how you approached this book, and what were the things about being a woman in academia that you sort of specifically wanted to highlight?
I really love the comparison between Robin and Alice, because one interesting thing about both of them is that they're sort of delusional about structural oppression, and they would rather not believe that known facts about the world apply to them. For a lot of Babel, Robin is convinced that if he just keeps his head down, if he's just good enough, if he's just an obedient subject, then the whole history that his country has with the British Empire can't possibly affect him on an interpersonal level. And his awakening, his radicalization comes when he realizes he can't escape his own past, and he can't escape his own racialization, and he can't keep living in both worlds. He has to pick a side at some point. Alice, similarly, is completely delusional about institutional sexism. She thinks it doesn't have to apply to her if she just pretends that it doesn't apply to her. And here's another reason why I set the text in the 1980s, because we're in this really weird middle period, this transition period between second and third wave feminism. So Alice is born after the fights of the generations that have been struggling for material rights for women. So the right to vote, the right to speak freely in public, the right not necessarily to get married, really, more reproductive control over one's own body, and really formal representation. All of these battles had been won, at least temporarily, when she's growing up. So she's actually in this cohort of young women who find sexism or discussions of sexism and feminism really embarrassing and passé. At this point, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex is already it's already fading out of popularity, and Alice is convinced that if I am just good enough at my work, I can walk this tightrope between being desirable and being an old hag, and it doesn't have to affect me. I'm just this mind. The boys can make jokes, but I don't have to listen to them, which, if I can keep talking for a bit, it kind of buys into this conservative backlash in the 80s on both sides of the Atlantic, this neoliberal mentality that's spreading under Reagan and Thatcher, which is this denial of systemic inequality, and rather this myth that if you struggle, if you suffer, it's your own fault. It's because you aren't acting to the best of your abilities, and you should just pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Everybody is responsible for their own fate, and you can't blame the system for it. And Alice really doesn't want to blame the system. So when bad things do happen to her, she has no concept of solidarity. She doesn't even have a framework to understand what's been done to her, and she's just trapped in this neoliberal, individual myth-making cage that she's been living in her whole life.
Yeah. Well, let's go on to character a bit more, since we're on the subject, and talk about Professor Grimes. Terrible person, but fascinating character. He's cruel, sloppy, tyrannical bully, yet Alice is drawn to him and feels very reliant on him. I have a similar relationship in one of my books, where there's an older, narcissistic male mentor with a young woman who feels like she's in his debt. And I was wondering, why this power dynamic and this relationship as the genesis of Alice's whole journey?
Well, it all started with when we saw Phantom of the Opera together. No, I'm really interested in not just the cults of the male genius, but the cults of the bad teacher. And because it's so hard to resist the seduction of the bad teacher, even when they come with an awful reputation, even when you know rationally this person is abusive. I don't need to let them treat me this way. I'm really interested in why, on the student side, one might still choose to keep working with somebody like that. I wonder if anybody's seen Damien Chazelle's film Whiplash. It's about, yeah, well, too few of you. It's really, really good. It's about this drumming student played by Miles Teller who just is in the thrall of this horrifically abusive music teacher who's physically abusive. He throws things at him. He makes him practice until his hands bleed. He berates him. He humiliates him in front of everybody else in the band and on stage. And Miles Teller's character just keeps on coming back to him like this dog who's been kicked but just, keeps whimpering and returning. And something that the film does so well is explain why one would do that. It's because the student thinks that, first of all, it's too late to back out, so all of the sacrifice must have been worth something. But also there's this myth that this is what it takes to achieve greatness, and this person chose me to abuse like this. They didn't choose anybody else, they're doing it to me. And so Alice and Peter are in the state of denial where they're like, ha ha ha, Grimes is so awful to us, but we love him, and we want to pull him out of hell. And there's this moment where they're finally able to speak honestly to each other about what they've gone through at Grimes's hands, and even then they decide, well, it's still worth it. We're still going to go get him. And they compare themselves to foot soldiers of a cause that they're not even really sure they believe in anymore. But they've joined the Athenians. They're at the gates of Troy. There is no going home. They have to see it out to the finish, because otherwise, what was it all for?
Yeah. Is there a teacher who had a particularly strong impact on you in your academic career? Not necessarily negative in the way of Grimes, but there was a lovely moment from Alice where she says, professors never knew the impact of their utterances. So do you have someone who made a particular impact on you?
I have a lot, but my high school debate coach, I think, is most special to me, and you know why.
I do.
I had a speech impediment all the way through elementary school to middle school, where I was just really afraid of speaking to anybody who wasn't my parents or my siblings. And I could form all the right sounds, but I wouldn't push air through my vocal cords. And then I joined the debate team, and I had this coach who taught me how to project and make myself heard, and taught me that my voice mattered. And look at me speaking so well right now. But he was also really important to my life because I met my husband for the first time in his office. Bennett was coming to our school to see if he was going to transfer there, like I had transferred after my freshman year. And we met and we shook hands, and he said, "This is so intimidating." And I was taller than him at that point. And then 11 years later, we had still kept up a really close relationship with this debate coach, and he officiated our wedding, and he told everybody how weird and dumb we were when we were children, and how cool and mature we were now.
It was so beautiful. I had the privilege of attending Rebecca's wedding, and it was such a lovely moment when I realized that that was your teacher officiating. It was really, really lovely. And speaking of which, this is probably your most personal work, I feel like, in terms of, I know that there's elements of you in your other work. The Poppy War has some of your family history in it. Yellowface is about the industry that you work in. But this one feels particularly personal in the way that it's so much inspired by, like you say, Bennett's chronic illness and your academic experience. Is that a little scary, or was it cathartic? As someone who has generally been quite private online, is it kind of scary to have something that's so transparently personal?
It's not just the most personal book, it's also the book that has the most of my husband's thoughts in it. All of my previous books I'd kind of conceived and written largely on my own, and then showed him mostly finished drafts, but because, again, I'm not a philosopher, and a lot of the cool ideas in this book come from how he thinks in the fields that he's interested in. So much of the book is our dialogues, a lot of Alice and Peter's back and forth, the shorthand and intimacy they have with each other that's based on our relationship. So it was very personal in the sense that I was falling in love, and I got married, and I was thinking very hard about what it means to love somebody, what it means to devote your life to them, what sacrifices it takes, how you build that trust, and how you become willing to be vulnerable in front of another person. And these are fun questions because they're questions explored in every single book about love, but it's the biggest unsolved problem, this magic between two people, because everybody has to figure it out by themselves for the first time. You can't just read a philosophical text on love and think, oh, that's it, I've got it. They solved this, the Greeks solved this. You all have to go through like a personal journey of figuring out how that feels, and I went through that journey with the help of a lot of classics. So yeah, this is a book about my relationship, and I was very nervous to share it, mostly because I don't like, I'm just very private about my personal life, but it turns out that Bennett's just so excited about all the attention. Not for him, like his image, but just his ideas. So all he wants to share with the world is that he wants Robert Pattinson to play him in the film adaptation.
I can actually kind of see that.
I can't.
It's the hair, something about the hair, anyway.
I think it's like the deranged, like, curiosity.
Yeah, that's true. All right, I've got to turn over to audience questions very soon, but I just have one more question for you. You've spoken about reinventing yourself as a writer every few years. What is next for you?
World War II.
No.
Oh, wait, no, that's a lie, because that's for the book I'm writing right now. But
Yes.
the book that's coming out next is a contemporary literary fiction novel. It's coming out next September. It's called Taipei's Story. It is not fantasy. It's really inspired by the prose styles of Elif Batuman and Patricia Lockwood, who I think are just hilariously funny and so good at delivering a punchline in very spare, elegant prose. And it returns to a lot of the same themes in Babel. It's about language and identity and grief and diaspora, subjectivity, and basically it's about a girl on a study abroad program in Taipei when her grandfather dies. So that was fun. I'm really proud of it. So that's the next book that I'll get to share with the world. But I'm just thinking a lot about World War II right now.
Okay, well, I can't wait to hear more about that. All right, so the lovely Waterstones staff will be coming around with some roving microphones. If you would like to put your hand up if you have a question for Rebecca. I'm going to be abstaining from decision making because I can't do that.
First of all, thank you so much for kicking off your tour here. That's so cool. Every time I read one of your books, I'm reminded of how fortunate I am that my PhD supervisor is one of my favorite people in the world, and she was lovely, and I do, just especially with Rin and her professors, and then obviously Babel. It's like, okay, I did get lucky. You mentioned Whiplash, which is one of my favorite films, despite the fact that I'm a nervous wreck, like the whole way through, just on the edge of your seat. On the same vein of like films, if you had to give a score or a soundtrack to sell the vibe of this book, what would it be?
Oh, great question. I happen to be a huge cinephile, so I thought about this a lot. I'll just give you two films because I did listen to the music from them while I was revising the book. The first is, it's really obvious, it's Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. We are a Nolan family, and it's set in Cambridge, they're physicists. I think the music that plays when they are in that realm of abstract ideas and the faces and bodies fall away and it's just shimmering bands of light, that's a place that Alice is always trying to reach. So it was nice to think about Cillian Murphy doing that. And the second influence is a little bit more sideways. It's Hayao Miyazaki's The Boy and the Heron. And now the Robert Pattinson link is obvious because he does this like deranged rasp for the heron. Like, it's not a sexy character, but if he were playing Peter, I would expect him to do that rasp. But if you haven't seen it, it's really gorgeous. It's a film about grief and death and the afterlife, and it's similarly just surrealist nonsense. It doesn't make any sense, and yet it makes so much sense on an intuitive, emotional level. There's a scene where one of the characters is in this dreamscape, and he's stacking impossible building blocks on each other, and he's talking about how every single day I remake the world, and I try to make it balance, and sometimes it falls, but I do my best every single day. And the music from The Boy and the Heron is transportative. It's gorgeous. So if you want to feel the same way you feel reading Katabasis, then I would watch those two films after.
Hello, my name is Tom. So sometimes there's some great books that come out which are done by two authors, such as Good Omens. If you two had to work together, what would it look like?
Probably more about Oxbridge, I would imagine.
Yeah. It was really interesting because I think we are increasingly obsessed with the same technical aspects of our prose. I remember we were on a writing retreat and Sam was getting really frustrated because she needed like a two-syllable word to fit the rhythm of this one sentence, and all the likely synonyms were too many syllables, and I forget what word it was, but Bennett did crack that problem.
Yeah, I remember that because I was trying to get all the writers involved in it, being like, guys, I need you to help me perfect this sentence on a rhythmic level. But yeah, I think we would probably take ages to write a book because we would be agonizing over all the sentences.
I think it would be like 1,000 pages long and
Yes.
have like 20 character perspectives. But I think we're also similar in that we're total control freaks,
Yes.
and we don't want to let other people into the creative process.
Yeah.
So I don't think I would ever co-write a book with anybody. It just doesn't seem fun.
Yeah, I would
Sorry,
like
in
to,
case you wanted.
I would like to still be friends with you. So maybe one day, we never know. Maybe we'll stop being control freaks.
Hello, this side. So I've followed you since the week that Poppy War dropped. So I've seen your writing evolve over time. And I have a question. I think all of the books before this, I felt they were very fueled by anger. And there was a lot of rage on systems and on structures. This one felt like it was just gazing at something from very far away. It did not seem angry. I think the only primary emotion I felt was there was a sense of exhaustion and also just observation. So do you think that went into the book? And secondly, do you think of it as a romance? Because I've fought with a lot of co-workers of mine because we got the proof. And they don't think of it as a romance book, and I do. So, yeah.
Wow, what an interesting question. I think hormonal birth control helps a lot with rage. But I think you're right in that I just am getting older, and I'm still deeply angry about a lot of things within the academy, but I'm also getting more tired and more jaded and really selective about where I perform that rage, because the really angry characters from my early works, they literally burn themselves up with it. And it's not clear that they create better futures. They throw tantrums in the interests of changing everything. But at the end of the day, a lot of this it's quite selfish. For instance, the ending of Babel is really morally ambivalent, because while the people, so sorry, this is a spoiler in case you haven't read Babel, but Robin goes to his death in this grand gesture of resistance, and while that might be true for the people around him that he has convinced to die with him, it's pretty clear in the text that he's not doing it from any heroic motive. He's just grieving, he's just suicidal, and he just wants to go out with the biggest possible bang, but he has stopped thinking about the future. Thinking about the future is a lot harder, and it's a burden that he can't carry, and he forces Victoire to carry it, which is why the book ends with her. It doesn't end with him. So with Katabasis, being in this mindset of it's actually really irresponsible to defer all thought of the future to just making a grand gesture and then exiting stage left. I think I am more interested in questions of survival and making changes that will benefit others who you might never meet and living under the conditions that you've met. So I think that's just like a personal maturity on my part that is reflected in my characters getting older and calmer and hopefully wiser. As for whether it's a romance, it would spoil the book to talk too much about their relationship. I think as romance as a genre has very strict, it seems to me, like expectations about plot beats and certain tropes, and I don't have all of those, and I don't represent all of those tropes. So going by the numbers, like you probably wouldn't want to put this book in the romance section of the store, but if the question is it really romantically interested in the intimacy between two people, an intimacy that is not just platonic, then yes, definitely it's romantic.
Hi, I'm curious to hear your take on time, particularly time in hell. Like, is it linear? Does it follow the laws of physics? Or is it more conceptual, where like moments of grief and agony are stretched out and prolonged, and then like joyous moments are fleeting? I'm just curious to see how time works in different realms.
This is such a fun question. I don't want to spoil the book, but I will say if you're interested in theories of time, there is a chapter in the last act that really investigates this theory of time as change and the particular torture that can happen to you if you become a withered stump of time, if you're cast outside that cycle of change, if time doesn't exist for you anymore, like it exists for everybody else who might be going through cycles of growth and rebirth and reinvention, etc., because that seems like the worst possible agony to me. I'm also really interested in what eternity looks like and infinity. I wrote this kind of deranged letter. I don't know if I also sent it to you, where I was just really upset about infinities. And somebody responded with a theory of a flashlight that didn't really help. But so since I was a kid, I was raised Christian, and because I was a kid, they told me that when you die, you go to this utopia where you just get to hang out with your friends and eat chocolate cake forever. And I was really bothered by this. Like, I stayed up late at night sobbing about the idea of having to eat chocolate cake with the same group of people for all of time, because it seemed, I was like, I think I could make it 2 or 3 weeks, but then I would be really, really bored. And it seems like you would have to become a totally different being in order to tolerate persistence on that kind of scale. It seemed like anything that had stakes, like anything that was precious to you, any form of harm, any form of bond between two things would, like that would not persist in the face of eternity. And where I'm getting at with this is this book called This Life by a scholar named Martin Hagland, who teaches in the comparative literature department at Yale. I audited one of his classes on Aristotle and the immortality of the soul. And in This Life, which weirdly has a blurb by Emily Ratajkowski, but she has great taste, I guess, because it's a really good book, Hagland makes the argument that heaven conceived of as kind of eternal pleasure, this place where we were a static, immortal soul that couldn't die and didn't change, this would be the worst thing ever. It would be like a bleak, gray, monotonous horizon. Nothing would matter to us. Nothing would be precious to us. There would be no stakes for anything. And in fact, the source of value is not things that last, but things that can be lost. We hold our loved ones close because we don't know how much time we get to have with them. And we treasure things because, like, once you eat an apple, it's gone. We treasure things that have a time limit. And rather than being scared of this, Haglund says that we ought to lean into it and treat those moments that we have as precious because they have meaning because they're limited. Once you have the horizon of eternity, they might as well just be grains of sand. I don't know if he uses that metaphor, but I just came up with it, and I think it's very good. So if you're interested in these questions of time and immortality, you might really like this life.
Also, which denomination of Christianity was it that said that there was chocolate cake in heaven? Because I didn't get that.
Well, so this is fun because I went to a Chinese Christian church, and I think we're just really loose about denominations. Nobody ever told us what Methodist or Presbyterian or Unitarian meant. We didn't even really have our own worship space. We would rent space from other churches and use whatever materials they had. So it was more of a form of immigrant community than it was a proper religious community with doctrinal coherence. So I got a really weird patchwork religious education, but I can tell you what every single image in the Sistine Chapel is referring to.
Nice.
Hi. So you've now explored linguistics and philosophy and used them as inspiration for your magic systems, but are there other academic fields that you would like to explore in the future?
Yeah, I'm interested in aesthetics and art theory and World War II, but I won't say much more than that.
Hello, thanks for the talk. It's been really interesting. So the question I've been thinking of has to do with the purpose of art in times of crisis and political unrest. And as someone in your position, as both an academic and writer, whose areas of expertise have been impacted by things like censorship, kind of a rise of anti-intellectualism and AI, what does it mean to you to write and create art in the current climate we're in?
What a hard question. I've actually given a whole lecture on this. That was precisely the topic of my Tolkien lecture in 2022. So you can find a 45-minute version of this answer online. But and there's many, many things I could address, but I think just one thing I'll linger on is the particular ability of literature to investigate another lived experiences through all its shades of complexity, to not reduce another soul to just a good person or a bad person, an ally or an enemy, but to really ask the reader to step into somebody else's shoes and experience their radical otherness. I think a lot of visual arts are able to do this as well, but this is something that ChatGPT just can't be capable of. It doesn't convey any subjectivity. It's just a predictive amalgamation of a lot of discursive fluff that's in the air. But I think it was Kazuo Ishiguro who put it this way: when you have successfully written a piece of prose, all you're doing is telling your reader, I feel this way, do you feel it too? And that's actually magical because we live in our separate skulls, and there's no way for me to jump from my mind into yours, but we have all these imperfect methods of communication where we can try to evoke one another's subjectivities, and that kind of radical openness to somebody else's other mind seems to be essential to an ethical attitude towards the world. So I think, that's a very philosophical answer, but I think it's right. I think art connects us deeply to people who are not like us and who we would never feel a natural inclination to protect or act on behalf of, and we need that. It's the glue that keeps us alive in the same place despite our differences.
I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions.
Hi. Thank you for your talk, by the way. I really enjoy how you kind of lose track of, like, get into like the really technical aspects and like lose track of the question, because same. My question is, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received from another author?
Read broadly, read as much as you can. The library is full of writing teachers. Read in translation, read outside your favorite genres, read across time periods, just like immerse yourself in this buffet of literary styles. Don't just read the stuff that's fun and easy for you, read the stuff that's challenging for you. And I think that's the only way that writers continue to improve. A lot of us never go to MFA programs. I didn't do an MFA. I hardly remember the one high school creative writing class I took. So I'm largely a self-taught writer who just reads a lot and tries to think actively about what's working in any text and incorporating that into my own craft.
One more question.
Hello. First of all, you're both amazing writers, and thank you so much for your books. I guess this is a question for both of you. So, Rebecca, you've done different genres. You've done grimdark, you've done historical fantasy, now you've done a few contemporary books, and Samantha, you've done like dystopian and epic fantasy. Is there any genre that you wouldn't touch or are scared to try?
I think for me it's probably sci-fi, actually. I just really don't have a scientific brain at all, or a mathematical brain. I know you can write softer forms of sci-fi, but I don't know. I think I will always be drawn to fantasy in some way. And I think I would like to try historical at some point. But yeah, I think it's probably going to be sci-fi that I stay away from, just because I just don't think I have the brain for it.
I think you absolutely have the disposition for historical
Thank you.
fantasy, or just historical fiction. Okay, this is kind of a cheating answer, but a lot of my friends are having children right now, and I am surrounded by an increasing number of toddlers, and so I have to buy books for toddlers, and I've been told a lot about, like, picture books with very few words, or just like a single sentence, and they seem really, really hard to write, because it's not just like, oh, let me say some things about a bear that ate his friend or whatever. Well, maybe there's not a book about that, but someone was explaining to me it has to be a book that would be like audibly stimulating to a child and have like the pedagogical craft of teaching them words, but it also has to be fun for the adult to read 50 times a day.
Yeah.
And I can't think of any book that I would read 50 times in a row, but like a good like a baby's book, like has to be tolerable to adults, and it's just like a totally different realm of creativity that I really respect. But now I know a children's bookseller who will just tell me what titles to buy, and I can pass them on without ever cracking them open myself.
I would love to be able to keep talking for the whole evening, but please give Rebecca a huge round of applause.